What's up guys, this is Evan with Backwoods Adventure Mods. Today we're here at 4-Wheel Concepts and we're going to walk through an installation and a debut of our new 2nd and 3rd gen Tacoma skid plate system. So that's 05 to current 4-wheel drive specific. A quick note before we start, this is a prototype unit, so if it looks a little bit different, the production unit, we may make a few cosmetic changes to it, but these instructions will apply. The mounting points are all the same. So it's all aluminum except for this beefy cross member at the back. It's 1/4 inch aluminum and 3/16 steel for the cross member. And if you happen to have our bumper, we have this connector bracket that you'll see in a minute, but it will install and make kind of a seamless flow from the bumper all the way back behind the transmission. So the first thing we're going to do is remove this flimsy stock skid plate. And we've already started. We've got the bolts out. I just wanted to show things that we're going to remove. So all the bolts out of this, I think there's 4. It comes off just behind it. There's one more. And these 2 braces that hold it up. We've got most of the hardware out of it as well. With that out of the way, we're going to start at the front, work our way back. Okay, just a quick overview of the hardware. I'm going to work from front to back. This front connector bracket, if you have our bumper and you order this piece, the front 2 holes use the front 2 holes of your winch. So if your front winch bolts are long enough, then you can reuse them. If not, you may need to source some longer bolts locally. We include a bolt and nut set in case you don't have a winch and therefore have no hardware. You can use the hardware we send. There's a chance that if you do have a winch, the bolts we send might thread into it, but check it first because sometimes it's a metric thread, sometimes it's standard. So make sure that it does actually thread in before you hit it with an impact. Okay, so that's the first little hardware set. The second set is going to include hardware for the front, middle, and rear bolts. The rear bolts are the skinnier ones and they'll utilize the spacer, and we'll go through this in just a little bit. And then this is your oil change plate. It bolts on with these clip nuts that you press into place and use the 1/4-20 hardware. So we'll do that in a minute as well. Moving rearward, the front of this plate shares the rear hardware from this plate. At the back of this plate, we've got these long carriage bolts, and these are basically a glorified washer that are chopped off to fit the cross member that's up there. And same thing, the front of this skid utilizes the same hardware. And then we've got this last hardware kit that's got the 7/16 bolts and nuts in it. That's going to be used to install the skid plate, and then the shortest thick carriage bolts are to install the back of this onto the cross member. The first step, since we have the Backwoods bumper, we're going to put this front connector plate on. If you don't have a Backwoods bumper, you can skip this step. Kind of like we just said, we had to run to the store and grab some bolts to fit this particular winch. This one uses an M10 by 1.5. Since these winches all use different thread pitches, we can't really account for that, so be prepared. Maybe the ones we send will work for you. In our case, they didn't. We're going to start by putting this bolt up into the front winch hole in the bumper. We're going to leave it just a little bit loose so we can slide the front skid plate under it. Next, we're going to put on the main engine skid plate. You'll notice a couple of the bolts are slightly longer than the other 2. If you're using our connector bracket, we're going to be going through 2 thicknesses of aluminum. So use the longer ones on the front. If you don't use our connector bracket, use the longer ones in the back because there's more room in the frame for the extra thread. This is the back of the engine skid plate. We use these skinniest bolts here. We've got these plastic spacers in the kit to take up this gap, so make sure to put those around the bolt as you install it. And leave this bolt really loose so we can get the next skid plate to slide on over it. So next we're going to install the transmission skid plate. It goes on top of the engine skid plate, but under the spacers. For the front side, these are basically a washer that sits on top of the frame. The flat side faces the outside and it goes against this flat piece right here. And you finish it off with a flat washer and a lock washer and the nut. We can install the last section. Before we can install the transfer case skid, we've got to put this cross member on. This is the steel cross member. It's a 3-piece for adjustability. To show you the orientation, you can see this notch here is facing the front and it goes on the driver's side and it's notched out for the transfer case. We've got these end brackets that hold it on, and these two little stickers need to come off. There's holes behind those that we're going to utilize. But before we can do that, we need to get rid of this little thing. There's one on each side. And the same over here. Okay, you'll notice that one of these holes is bigger than the other. So we've included a slightly bigger bolt, which is metric, and then for the smaller holes, we've got some littler 1/4-20. So we're going to put those in respectively. We're just going to through bolt it. Okay, for the driver's side, this is optional, but we want to utilize both holes. You can either choose to put the one metric bolt back in and let this little tang occupy the second hole, but what we're going to do is cut the little tang off so that we can use both bolt holes. So we're just going to trim that tang off with a grinder and a cutoff wheel. So before I thread the top bolt in, I've already put the 1/4-20 bolt in from the inside out. That's going to make it a lot easier to tighten everything down. We can go ahead and tighten this down. Just hold it all the way up against the frame. Next, we're going to put the cross member on the cross member brackets. That's going to be these 6 7/16 bolts. Once you get this cross member bolted on and tightened up, it's time for the last skid plate. And these slots just slide around the bolts we already put in and on top of the transmission skid plate. And we install with these 7/16 carriage bolts. Okay, now we can go through and tighten everything up. All right guys, we got all the bolts tightened down and that wraps it up. This has been our second and third gen Tacoma 4-wheel drive skid plate system. If you guys have any other questions, reach out to us at backwoodsadventuremods.com.